I'm sorry, Mr. Kang, but I don't love you. The silence that fell over the penthouse office was so absolute that the distant hum of Seoul's night traffic seemed to vanish entirely. 29-year-old Kang Tae-hyun, the man whose single nod could shift billions in equity or silence a street in the underworld, did not move. His dark, impenetrable eyes remained fixed on Amara Bennett. For weeks, as she curated the creative vision for his flagship launch, he had watched her navigate his world with an unyielding grace. He had fallen quietly, completely, and irrevocably. But as he stood before her, having just laid his heart open for the first time in his life, he was met not with reverence or ambition, but with a quiet, sorrowful firmness. Amara stood her ground, her deep brown eyes steady despite the tremor in her pulse. She saw the absolute power he wielded, the sharp, tailored suit, the dangerous shadow that followed his every step. She knew what he was capable of, and she refused to let herself become another prize acquired by Korea's most feared man. Tae-hyun set his crystal glass down onto the mahogany desk. The faint clinking sound echoed like a crack in marble. He took a single step toward her, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the soft floor lighting. Yet as he looked down at her, the cold, ruthless mask that intimidated entire boardrooms shattered. In its place was something raw, exposed, and deeply human. "Give me 30 days," he said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet murmur that belonged only to her. Amara crossed her arms, holding onto her composure. "For what?" "30 days to earn your heart," Tae-hyun replied, stepping closer until she could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. "No money, no luxury gifts, no guards, no power, no coercion. Just me. Let me show you who I am when the world isn't watching." Amara frowned, searching his face for any sign of a trap. "And if you fail? If after 30 days nothing changes?" The most powerful man in Seoul looked directly into her eyes, completely defenseless. "Then I walk away. I will step out of your life, clear your path, and you will never have to see my face again." A heavy beat passed. Amara looked at the billionaire, who could burn down empires, now holding his breath, waiting for her permission. She saw no arrogance in his posture, only a desperate, quiet patience. She took a slow breath and nodded once. 30 days, Mr. Kang." "Tae-hyun," he corrected softly, the faintest trace of warmth softening his sharp features. "Starting tomorrow. It's just Tae-hyun." Amara turned toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know it yet, but 30 days was all it would take for Seoul's coldest monster to surrender his entire world to her. 2 weeks before she ever heard his desperate plea, Amara saw the side of Kang Tae-hyun that kept the city in terror. It was late in the evening, inside the sleek glass and steel expanse of the Grand Convention Hall. Amara had been double-checking the lighting schematics for the upcoming launch, when a low, suffocating silence drifted down the marble corridor. Curiosity drew her to the shadows, near the executive lounge, where she found Tae-hyun standing under the dim overhead lights. He looked imperious. Dressed in a charcoal suit, his hands rested casually in his pockets, his posture utterly relaxed, while a senior executive, a man twice his age, kneeled on the polished floor, trembling violently. "I gave you one instruction, Director Park," Tae-hyun said softly. His voice lacked any anger, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was the smooth, flat tone of a man deciding whether to step on an insect. "You failed. And in my world, failure is not a mistake. It is a choice." "Please, Chairman Kang." The older man sobbed, his forehead nearly touching the marble. "My family, my reputation. Give me one more chance. I'll fix it." "You have no reputation left to save," Tae-hyun replied, his dark eyes entirely hollow. "By tomorrow morning, your assets will be frozen, your career ruined, and your name erased from this company. Be grateful I am letting you walk out of this building on your own 2 feet. The sheer coldness of it made Amara's blood run hot. Before her mind could reason with the danger, her body moved. She stepped out of the shadows, her heels clicking firmly against the stone. Is this how you measure your strength, Mr. Kang? Tae-hyun's head turned slowly. His gaze, sharp enough to cut glass, locked onto her. Beside him, 2 shadow-draped bodyguards immediately shifted forward, but Tae-hyun raised a single hand, stopping them instantly. He studied the young black woman standing before him, unarmed, unprotected, yet looking at him with fiery disdain. You are trespassing, Miss Bennett, he murmured, his voice dangerous. And you are abusing someone who is already broken, Amara countered, stepping closer without a flinch. He made a mistake. You have every right to fire him. But stripping away a man's dignity just because you hold all the power? That isn't authority. That's cowardice. A heavy, suffocating stillness gripped the hallway. The bodyguards looked terrified for her. No one had ever spoken to Kang Tae-hyun like that and survived the aftermath with their career intact. Tae-hyun stared at her. For the first time in his life, he didn't see fear in the eyes looking back at him. He saw absolute moral clarity and an unwavering courage that refused to bow to his aura. Something deep within his chest shifted, an unexpected spark igniting in a cold, dark place. He didn't scream. He didn't order her removal. He simply looked at Amara Bennett, truly looked at her, and realized his world had just fundamentally changed. Day 1 began with a quiet challenge. Amara sat at the central work table of her rented design studio in Gangnam, surrounded by color swatches, structural blueprints, and half-assembled floral installations. She expected a grand display, a fleet of black sedans blocking the street, expensive arrangements of rare orchids, or a legion of bodyguards posting outside her door. That was how men like Kang Tae-hyun operated. They bought space, they conquered territory. Instead, the brass bell above the studio door chimed softly at precisely 8 in the morning. When Amara looked up, her breath caught. Tae-hyun stepped inside alone. The sharp, suffocating charcoal suit was gone. In its place, he wore a simple black cashmere sweater, dark tailored trousers, and no watch. His dark hair fell naturally over his forehead, softening the harsh, intimidating angles of his face. He looked stripped of his empire, absurdly handsome, and strikingly human. You're early, Mr. Kang, Amara said, keeping her tone measured as she set down her drafting pen. Tae-hyun, he gently corrected, closing the door behind him. He stayed near the entrance, maintaining a respectful distance. And I am right on time. Amara stood, resting her hands on the edge of the wooden table. Before we begin this 30-day experiment, we need ground rules. If you want a genuine chance, it happens on my terms. Tae-hyun inclined his head, his dark eyes fixed entirely on her. Name them. First, no gifts, she stated firmly, her voice carrying an unshakable dignity. No flowers, no jewelry, no sudden investments in my agency. My affection is not an asset you can acquire. Second, no bodyguards hovering around us or intimidating my staff. And third, you do not use your corporate leverage or your name to make my life easier. If we are doing this, you exist in my world as an ordinary man. She expected a flicker of annoyance, perhaps a subtle flex of his usual authority. Instead, Tae-hyun simply nodded, his gaze steady and warm. Agreed, he said softly. No leverage, no gifts, no shadows. He took a few slow, deliberate steps toward her workspace, looking around at the sketches pinned to the corkboards. So, what are my duties for today? Amara blinked, caught off guard. Your duties? I asked for 30 days to prove myself. Tae-hyun murmured, stopping just on the other side of her drafting table. A faint, rare trace of a smile touched the corner of his lips. I am here to shadow you. Teach me what you do, Amara. Let me help. Looking at the most feared man in Seoul waiting patiently for her instruction, Amara felt the first quiet crack in her defense. She handed him a pair of shears and pointed toward a crate of imported greenery. Then start by stripping those stems. Tae-hyun took the shears without a word, stepping willingly into her world. By 9 in the evening, the sky over Seoul broke open. Heavy, torrential rain slammed against the studio's floor-to-ceiling windows, drowning out the city noise and trapping them inside. The power flickered once, twice, before cutting out entirely, plunging the room into a deep, velvety darkness. Amara reached for a crate of emergency candles, her hands steady as she struck a match. Warm light flickered to life, casting long shadows across the floral arrangements and drafting paper. Tae-hyun sat quietly on a low wooden bench near the back, his phone dark on the table beside him. For 12 hours, he had not checked a single message, answered a single board member, or issued a single command. You can leave if you need to, Amara said softly, placing a candle near him. I'm sure your driver can find a way through the storm. I told him to go home hours ago, Tae-hyun replied, his voice a calm murmur in the shadowed room. He looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the amber flame. I am right where I want to be. Amara pulled up a stool across from him, wrapping her arms loosely around her knees. The ambient storm outside created a strange, intimate sanctuary, stripping away the roles they played during the day. Why are you really doing this, Tae-hyun? She asked gently. A man in your position doesn't surrender control. Not for 30 days. Not for anyone. Tae-hyun leaned back against the brick wall, staring down at his hands. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic drum of rain against the glass. When I was 7 years old, my father told me that trust was a luxury for dead men, he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only an ancient, quiet exhaustion. I was raised to view people as instruments, either useful or dangerous. In my world, if you show a single moment of softness, someone uses it to destroy you. Amara listened, her dark eyes filled with compassionate stillness. She didn't interrupt. She simply let him speak. For 22 years, I built a fortress. Tae-hyun continued, looking up to meet her gaze. I became the monster everyone feared, so no one could ever hurt me again. It worked. Everyone obeys me. Everyone fears me. He paused, his breath hitching slightly. And I have never been more entirely alone. He stepped closer to the edge of his bench, his expression vulnerable in a way no living person had ever witnessed. Until the night you stood up to me in that corridor, he murmured softly. You looked past the power, past the reputation, and saw me, really saw me. You didn't bow, Amara. You challenged me to be better. Amara felt a heavy, bittersweet ache in her chest. She saw the immense weight he carried every second of his life, the price of absolute control. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers gently touching his sleeve. Tae-hyun froze, staring down at her hand as if her light touch was the most precious thing in Seoul. The morning light brought a quiet disaster. When Amara unlocked the studio on day 10, her breath caught in her throat. The main display hall was in ruins. Over half of the rare, custom-imported botanical installations meant for the corporate preview had been slashed to shreds, their delicate stems crushed and soaked in corrosive chemical spray. A local supplier who had aggressively tried to force her agency out of Seoul had left his silent mark. Amara sank against the doorframe, her heart dropping. Weeks of meticulous labor, gone in an instant. Her reputation, her business, her dignity, in a foreign city, all hanging by a thread. The door opened behind her. Tae-hyun, stepped inside, taking in the destruction with a single sweeping glance. For a dangerous fraction of a second, a dark, terrifying frost settled over his features. The shadow of the underworld sovereign flared, the impulse to locate the supplier and completely erase his existence from Korea by nightfall. Amara saw the terrifying shift in his eyes and placed a gentle hand against his arm. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "No threats. No power. You promised." Tae-hyun closed his eyes, taking a slow, grounding breath. When he opened them, the cold monster was gone. Only devotion remained. "I promised," he said softly. He unbuttoned his jacket, tossed it onto a clean chair, and rolled up his crisp white sleeves. "Show me what can be saved." For the next 14 hours, Tae-hyun did not make a single phone call. He did not summon his syndicate, nor did he use his billions to buy replacement stock. Instead, he stayed by her side on the cold concrete floor. The man who dictated the movements of Korea's economy spent the entire night stripping ruined leaves, binding fragile stems with wire, and meticulously restitching hand-woven archways alongside her. His hands, unaccustomed to such delicate labor, bled faintly from thorn pricks, but he never complained. He worked with a quiet, focused tenderness, learning the rhythm of her craft, handing her tools before she even asked for them. When her energy flagged, at 3 a.m, he quietly brewed her tea, placing the hot mug in her cold hands without a word. By dawn, the main installation was restored, not just saved, but transformed into something even more breathtakingly complex. Amara sat on the floor, exhausted, looking at the stunning archway, bathed in the early golden sunlight. She turned to look at Tae-hyun. He was sitting beside her, his clothes smudged with soil, his dark hair messy, his hands calloused and tired. "You could have ended this with a single phone call," she murmured, her dark eyes shining with an overwhelming warmth. "Why didn't you?" Tae-hyun looked at her, his expression filled with an aching, unconditional gentleness. "Because your dignity is worth more than my power," he said quietly. "I didn't want to conquer your problem, Amara. I wanted to carry it with you." By day 15, the grueling pace of Tae-hyun's dual existence finally caught up to him. Managing an empire by night and laboring silently in Amara's studio by day took its toll. When he failed to appear at her door at his usual 8 o'clock sharp, Amara felt a sudden sharp coldness settle in her chest. Following the address he had given her for emergencies, she arrived at his private penthouse. The vast, minimalist space was quiet and shadow-drenched. She found him in his bedroom, stripped of his usual armor, lying motionless under dark sheets. His skin was flushed, his breathing shallow and hot with fever. When he heard her footsteps, Tae-hyun forced his eyes open, his body tense. "Amara," he rasped, struggling to sit up. "You shouldn't be here. I told my people not to call you. I didn't want you to see me like this." "Lie back down," she commanded softly, her voice filled with an undeniable authority that brooked no argument. When he reached for his phone to call a private physician, she gently took the device from his weak grip and set it aside. She spent the next several hours by his bedside, wringing out cool cloths to lay across his brow, administering medicine and keeping vigil as the fever raged. As the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, painting the room in soft hues of amber, Tae-hyun's breathing finally leveled out. His fever broke, leaving him weak and lucid. He lay on his side, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Amara as she sat on the edge of the mattress, adjusting the damp cloth on his forehead. "Why are you staying?" he murmured, his voice barely louder than a whisper, rough with emotion. "You owe me nothing." Amara looked down at him, her dark eyes shining with an earnest, quiet warmth. "Because I care about you, Tae-hyun. Not the CEO, and not the man everyone fears, just you." Tae-hyun closed his eyes briefly, a shuddering breath escaping his lips. He reached out, his long fingers gently catching her hand, holding it against his chest over his slow, steady heartbeat. "I'm terrified, Amara," he whispered into the quiet room. It was the first time in his life he had ever uttered those words to another human being. Amara leaned closer, her pulse fluttering. Terrified of what? Day 30, Tae-hyun admitted, his fever-bright eyes searching hers with heartbreaking honesty. "I am terrified of the morning the 30 days end. I have spent my entire life building an empire where I control everything, yet I am completely powerless to stop the clock. If you tell me to leave, I will walk away because I promised you, but losing you will destroy whatever part of me is left alive." Amara felt her heart ache with a deep, consuming tenderness. The untouchable sovereign of Seoul lay before her, entirely exposed, placing his whole heart in her hands without a single defense. Gently, she turned her palm and interlaced her fingers with his. By day 20, the barrier between them had thinned to a whisper. Craving a moment outside the oppressive shadows of his wealth and her tight deadlines, they walked through a late-night street market on the quiet outskirts of Seoul. The narrow alleyways were warm and alive, lit by hanging paper lanterns and the hum of street vendors preparing steam-filled comfort food. For the first time, Tae-hyun walked beside Amara without a suit jacket, his stance relaxed, his shoulder brushing against hers in the cool night air. They stopped at a small stall to admire handmade ceramic vases. The elderly shopkeeper, taking in Amara's deep brown skin and striking presence alongside Tae-hyun, sneered subtly. He shifted his stance, speaking in rapid, hushed Korean, with an underlying tone of clear prejudice, assuming the foreign woman would not understand, while glancing dismissively at her artistic touch on his items. "Tell your guests not to touch the delicate work," the vendor muttered coldly to Tae-hyun. "People like her don't understand the value of traditional craft." Amara stiffened. She understood enough of the language to catch the sting beneath the words, a familiar ache rising in her throat. She began to step back, preparing to quiet her own dignity as she had so many times before. She expected Tae-hyun to react with the swift, terrifying authority of the underworld. She braced for him to snap, to shatter the man's livelihood with a single phone call or a dark, unspoken threat. Instead, Tae-hyun simply stepped forward, placing a gentle, reassuring hand at the small of Amara's back. His touch was warm, grounding, and steady. Looking at the vendor, Tae-hyun's expression remained utterly calm. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in flawless, measured Korean, with a quiet, unmistakable elegance that made the vendor instantly freeze. "You speak of tradition, yet you forget the core of our culture. Respect for a guest," Tae-hyun said softly, his dark eyes carrying an intelligent, unyielding light. "This woman is an internationally acclaimed artist, whose vision transforms every space she touches. Her hands create beauty that elevates your craft merely by association. You should feel honored she chose to stop at your stall." The vendor's face flushed red with instant shame. He lowered his head, stammering a quiet, deeply humbled apology. Tae-hyun didn't gloat. He simply bowed his head respectfully to the older man, guided Amara gently away from the stall, and stepped back into the lantern-lit street. Amara stopped near the edge of the market, turning to look at him. The cool breeze moved through his black hair, softening his sharp features. "You didn't use fear," she whispered, her dark eyes searching his, with an intense, quiet vulnerability. "I don't need fear to defend what is precious to me," Tae-hyun replied softly, reaching out to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, sending a warm shiver straight to her core. Looking into his gentle eyes, Amara felt The last wall around her heart crumbled to dust. On day 25, the darkness Tae-hyun had worked so tirelessly to hold at bay finally breached the perimeter of their quiet sanctuary. It did not arrive with weapons, but with calculated poison. By mid-morning, notification alerts flooded Amara's phone in a relentless cascade. Headlines across major entertainment and business tabloids blared fabricated stories designed to systematically dismantle her career. Fabricated internal memos, doctored photos, and anonymous quotes falsely accused her design firm of financial fraud and operating as an illegal front for international money laundering. Within hours, 3 of her major global clients pulled out of their contracts, citing reputational damage. Amara stood in the center of her studio, her vision blurring as the phone rang endlessly on her desk. Her name, built on years of unblemished integrity and tireless devotion to her craft, was being burned to ashes before her eyes. The door burst open, and Tae-hyun stepped inside. For the first time in weeks, he was surrounded by 3 dark-suited men who stood outside the glass doors, their expressions grim and hyper-vigilant. The aura of absolute power and terrifying authority surged around him once more. But as his eyes landed on Amara's pale face, his expression shattered into pure, agonizing guilt. "It's Director Han," Tae-hyun said, his voice clipped and heavy with a dark, suffocating weight. He crossed the room, stopping just inches from her, his hands trembling slightly as he resisted the urge to pull her into his arms. "He is an old rival from my past. He knows he cannot strike at me directly, so he used his media connections to attack what I hold most dear. He knew targeting your reputation would destroy you." Amara looked at him, feeling the true, terrifying reach of his world for the first time. It wasn't just physical danger, it was an insidious force that could reach out from the shadows and erase a person's entire life. Work with a single press release. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her connection to Tae-hyun had painted an invisible target on her back. "They're destroying my life, Tae-hyun," she whispered, her voice cracking under the overwhelming weight of helplessness. "My agency, my integrity, everything I built on my own." Tae-hyun closed his eyes, a look of profound, agonizing pain washing over his sharp features. He stepped closer, his large, warm hand gently taking hers, holding it with a desperate, protective tightness. "Look at me, Amara," he murmured softly, his dark eyes filled with an intense, unyielding promise. "I brought this darkness to your doorstep, and I will tear it down with my own hands. I promise you, on my life, he will not ruin you." Amara looked into his eyes, seeing not the cold monster of Seoul, but a man who was willing to wage war on his own world just to save hers. By day 27, Tae-hyun knew the only way to save Amara was to strip himself of the very power that defined him. He sat alone in his high-altitude boardroom late into the night, the gleaming lights of Seoul sprawling beneath him like a carpet of cold diamonds. Spread across the dark mahogany table were dozens of legal documents, stack after stack, bearing the heavy gold seals of his primary syndicate holdings and corporate subsidiaries. To destroy Director Han's leverage without triggering a bloody war that would put Amara in perpetual crosshairs, Tae-hyun chose a path no sovereign of the city had ever taken. He initiated a full, legally binding divestment of his entire controlling interest in the syndicate. He signed away decades of territorial control, billions in shadowy assets, and the absolute leverage that made entire boardrooms tremble. Without his connection to the underworld, Han's smear campaign instantly lost its fuel. The media narratives collapsed without a target, and Tae-hyun's legal teams systematically forced public retractions, restoring Amara's agency and pristine reputation to its full glory. He had saved her. But in doing so, he had stripped away his own armor, leaving himself entirely exposed to his enemies, and deeply aware of the target that would forever hang over anyone close to him. Standing in the center of his quiet apartment, surrounded by packed leather trunks, Tae-hyun picked up his fountain pen one last time. He drew a quiet, agonizing breath, his heart aching with a profound, quiet despair. He could not risk her safety again. Her dignity, her dream, her beautiful light, they were too pure to be dragged into his eternal winter. He had promised to show her who he was without power or money, but he realized now that even his love could become a dangerous weapon in the hands of his rivals. He pulled out a heavy sheet of cream stationery and began to write, his hand steady despite the quiet tear that traced the sharp line of his jaw. He was leaving 3 days early. He was honoring his vow, stepping out of her path before the 30 days expired, willing to live the rest of his life in absolute solitary silence, as long as she remained safe, free, and untouched by his darkness. "I promised I would walk away if I could not guarantee your peace," he wrote, his low voice echoing only in his mind as the dark ink bled onto the page. "You gave me 30 days of humanity, Amara. That was more than I deserved in a lifetime." He folded the letter, placed it alongside the full legal releases, securing her design firm's international future, and set it on the table. Tae-hyun took one last agonizing look out at the city he used to rule, ready to disappear into the dark forever. When Amara unlocked her studio on day 28, she was met not by Tae-hyun, but by an immaculate leather portfolio resting on her desk. Inside lay the signed legal releases, completely restoring her agency's global reputation and securing her business under absolute, permanent protection. Beside them sat a single sheet of cream stationery, filled with his elegant, precise handwriting. As her eyes traced his final words, her heart shattered. He was gone. He had divested his empire, relinquished his power, and vanished into the shadows, leaving 3 days early because he truly believed his presence would only ever bring danger to her life. He had sacrificed everything he owned to grant her peace, choosing to endure a lifetime of solitary silence so that she could flourish untouched by his dark world. Amara sank into her chair. The letter clutched against her chest as hot tears finally spilled over her lashes. The studio felt unnaturally cold, vast and empty without him. For weeks she had guarded her heart behind walls of caution, terrified that loving Kang Tae-hyun meant forfeiting her autonomy and becoming a possession in his empire. But staring at his final sacrifice, the devastating truth washed over her with overwhelming clarity. Tae-hyun had never tried to own her. He had stripped away his suits, his money, his bodyguards, and his terrifying reputation just to stand beside her on a cold floor, stripping stems until his hands bled. He had bowed his head to protect her honor, stayed awake through the night to fix her ruined installations, and laid his heart entirely defenseless in her hands. Her fear had lied to her. It had painted a monster where there was only a man who valued her dignity, her agency, and her happiness far above his own life. Amara stood up, wiping her tears with a fierce, quiet resolve. She looked at the remaining days marked on her calendar. The 30 days were not over, and she refused to let the one man who truly loved her walk away into the dark alone. On day 30, the old suburban train depot on the quiet edge of Seoul was bathed in the pale, misty light of early dawn. It was the place where a penniless, orphaned 9-year-old Kang Tae-hyun had first arrived decades ago. long before he became a king in the shadows. Now dressed in a plain coat with a single leather bag at his feet, he stood on the cold platform, waiting for the train that would carry him away from Korea forever. He stared down the empty iron tracks, his sharp features etched with an ancient, quiet grief. He had given up his empire, his status, and his name. Yet the loss of his power was nothing compared to the devastating emptiness echoing in his chest. A sudden flurry of rushed footsteps broke the morning stillness. Tae-hyun turned slowly, his dark eyes widening in disbelief. Amara stood at the end of the platform, her long coat wind-swept, her breath catching in chest-heaving gasps. She had searched the entire city, tracing the quiet remnants of his past until she found him. "You promised me 30 days, Kang Tae-hyun," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she stepped closer, her deep brown eyes shining with an unyielding, fierce warmth. "You don't get to leave on day 28. Tae-hyun's chest tightened, a quiet panic rising in his throat. "Amara, you shouldn't be here," he murmured, taking a step back to keep his distance, his voice raw with devotion and fear. "I stripped away my world to keep you safe. My presence will only ever bring danger to yours." "I don't care about the danger," Amara declared, closing the distance between them until she stood directly before him, refusing to let him run. She reached out, her warm hands gently framing his face, her thumb softly brushing against his cheekbone. Tae-hyun leaned into her touch instinctively, his eyes fluttering shut as a shuddering breath escaped his lips. "For 30 days, you showed me the man beneath the monster," she whispered softly, looking deep into his exposed, beautiful soul. "You proved that you didn't want to conquer my life. Tae-hyun, you wanted to share it. I was so terrified of losing my independence that I almost missed the only man who truly saw me, respected me, and loved me unconditionally." Tae-hyun's hands came up to cover hers, his long fingers trembling as he held her palms against his skin. "Amara, I am not standing here because you forced me or because of your power," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek, illuminated by the rising sun. "I am here because I love you, completely, freely, and without fear. And I choose you." The quiet sanctuary of the platform seemed to melt away. The sovereign of Seoul, the man who had never bowed to anyone, slowly lowered his forehead against hers, a quiet sob of overwhelming relief catching in his throat. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, holding her as if she were the only real thing in the entire world. When he pulled back to look at her, the cold, emotionless mask was gone forever, replaced by an radiant, breathtaking warmth. He leaned down and captured her lips in a deep, slow, reverent kiss, a quiet promise of a new beginning, built on mutual truth, earned trust, and an unbreakable love.